This is a training on understanding racism, and the purpose of the training, as you can see from the text on the screen, is to build up a model which is formed basically of our attitudes, our power to discriminate, the operation of an ideology of white superiority, which then ends up in racism. What I'd like to do is take a label, a white sticky label if you like, and on it, write on it a name you'd like to be called, a value system you use, something which describes you, something else which describes you which people can't tell from looking at you, and your class or status. So we'll pause the video here for you to do that. As you may have found, it's difficult to label, but it's something that we do every day. And there's no absolute value attached to the words. Our own identity changes over time, but we don't allow for this when we label. And we ascribe different weights to labels. There are labels we can avoid, ones that stick, ones that we can hide behind, ones that we are given or born with. I'd like you to have a go at this exercise, which is spotting the norm. Look at the 7 items there and see if you can spot which is the norm. For example, in this country they drive on the wrong side of the road. The norm being that people drive in the UK on the left, but it's not that for everywhere that we go. Norming is something we do in everyday communication. We start with the idea, in fact, that we are the norm. There's a hierarchy of normality. The norm resides in the superior. So who are normal? In this exercise, you're going to an island and you're deciding who to take with you. You'll be on the island for 50 years. You have water, food, access to shelter, materials, and will live there totally excluded. The aim is to form a functioning, viable society, and you can only choose 12 people from the following list. Once you have your list, I want you to write down in 2 columns the criteria and the assumptions that you used to make the list. So you may have chosen, for example, as criteria, survival skills. You wanted a variety of people, who you particularly liked or you didn't like, who you think might work hard, whether or not they were male or female, so your society will be sustainable in 50 years with children, or perhaps with personalities. Your assumptions could have been around, were they competent at the job, were they skilled at only one thing, were they old or young, what sex they were. Would you rather have old people who would make a contribution, or maybe you have some idea of their strength of character? The purpose of the Fresh Start exercise is to bring to mind the way that we stereotype. I didn't tell you anything about the assumptions or criteria that you should use to make your decision, but you had to use assumptions and criteria to make your list of 12. The idea behind this session is to bring to mind how we stereotype. So, for example, was the farmer any good at his job? What did you think about the retired carpenter? Was it somebody who was skilled at the particular type of carpentry that you needed? Who was the army sergeant aged 50 years? Was it a male or a female? The unemployed teenager, did you choose them? Why? There are a few people on the list who have to be female: the pregnant teenager and the grandmother with arthritis. Did you take them? Or did you end up with an all-male list? A stereotype is an opinion, often negative, based on a generalisation about a whole group or category of people. An assumption is an opinion that we make without the basis of fact. Did you ascribe colour or gender or sexuality to your list? A prejudice is a preconceived idea. The conclusion to the exercises that we've just done is that we label, we norm, we stereotype, we prejudge, we make assumptions, we have values, and all these things inform our attitudes. Our attitudes then go on to affect our behaviour and relations with other people and our involvement in institutions and the way that we work or the way that we act. I'd like you to write down an example of some time in your life when you were discriminated against and when you discriminated against somebody else. Think of a time from when you were a child perhaps, or when you were treated unfairly because of something that you couldn't change. So when you write down your example, describe who did it, what it was, who got it, and what type of discrimination it was. Stop. So now write down, how did it feel when you got discriminated against? What did you want to do? What were your leftover feelings? What did it feel when you gave the discrimination? So who gets discriminated against? And who gives discrimination? Well, the answer is everybody. We all at some point in our lives have been discriminated against, and we all at some point in our lives have discriminated against somebody else. The point is that the type of discrimination can vary in quantity, in quality, it can be temporary or permanent. Some are more visible, some inescapable, some can be protected against, some is based on information, some becomes multiple, and some is more personal. And who gets discrimination? Everyone. Minorities, women, homeless people, people with disabilities, elderly people, young people, bishops, lawyers, architects. So looking back at the model, we've talked a bit about our attitudes, and we've just done some exercises on discrimination. Discrimination has with it the deprivation of resources and opportunities. It can be direct, indirect, or can come about through our inaction. Essentially, it's something we do because we have the power to do it. The next part of the model is to discuss the ideology behind racism. To evidence the existence of this ideology today, I'm going to ask you to make two lists. The first list is going to be describing the messages that you've received either directly or from what you've heard said about black people and their culture. The second list I want you to make is about the messages that you've received either directly or heard said about white people and their culture. I'd like you now to compare the two lists that you've made. Did you find that one was longer in terms of the list regarding black people? Did it have more messages about intelligence, bodily functions, and was it very personal? In the second list, did you find aspects of things being civilized, noble, clean, arrogant, or cultured? The first list that you produced is evidence of an ideology of white superiority having an effect today in today's society. These are messages deriving from a time when, in fact, white people were held to be superior and have been transmitted by cultural methods in writing, in thinking, in plays, media, religious politics and the law down the ages. The hundreds of years of slavery has left its mark today. The ideology of white superiority was constructed in order to maintain the economy of slavery over hundreds of years. So now I'd like you to imagine that you're on a spaceship travelling to Mars on a one-way trip. You only have enough fuel to get to Mars. When you land, you will live on Mars. You know that all the people on Mars believe that you have the attributes that have been described in the first list, i.e., what things you have heard and said about black people. The Martians think that this is what you're like. Answer the following questions for yourself. How do you feel? What will you do when you land? What will you say to the Martians? So going back to the model, our attitudes plus the power to act plus our ability to discriminate, together with the operation of an ideology of white superiority, ends up with racism. Racism then is an ideology that's internalized by both the culture of those affected and the culture of those who perpetrate it. Our institutions have internalized the racism in the way that they operate and in their structures. So racism is a serious problem. We didn't start it, we don't have to feel guilty about it, but we can do something about it. The institutional expression of the ideology is what we call institutional racism. The way that institutions and organisations may systematically or repeatedly treat people differently because of their race, culture, ethnicity, or colour. The purveyors of the ideology is you and I. The model that we've been looking at can be written in a different way. It can show a cycle of racism where our attitudes, the power to act, the power to discriminate, ideology, which then again informs our attitudes. This cycle of racism needs to be broken. And when we break the cycle, we then start forming strategies to combat racism. Of course, there is only one human race. The races, so-called, that we decide to use are arbitrary distinctions that we create. Race itself is a construct. Culture is learnt behaviour, and ethnicity is something which possibly attributes to something that we cannot change about perhaps where we were born.